Thanks everybody so much for joining us. My name is Tessa Archibald. I'm a policy associate with the Animal Welfare Institute, and I manage the Homes for Horses Coalition. Just a couple things to keep in mind as we get started. Please stay on mute just so we can hear our speaker clearly. And this will be recorded, so no worries if you need to hop off or you're looking to share it with somebody later. We will save questions to the end, but feel free to put them in the chat just so you don't forget them. I'll be monitoring that so we can keep them in mind for the end. Many of you joining today are members of the Homes for Horses Coalition, but for those of you who aren't, I can share a short introduction. The Homes for Horses Coalition has been active since 2007, when it started as a unique coalition to help horse rescues and ultimately help equines by ending horse slaughter. Today, HHC is led by the Animal Welfare Institute and American Wild Horse Conservation and has over 500 members who are equine rescue directors, equine professionals, and equine advocates. HHC is dedicated to providing spaces for collaboration and connection and continued learning like this within the equine rescue world, as well as furthering advocacy to improve the lives of equines through legislation and policy. So we have a fantastic speaker joining us today, Dr. William Taylor. Dr. William T. Taylor is the author of Hoof Beats, How Horses Shaped Human History, and he's an assistant professor and curator of archaeology at the University of Colorado-Boulder. His work explores the domestication of the horse and the ancient relationships between horses and people through archaeozoology and archaeological science. William received his Ph.D. with distinction from the University of New Mexico, and his work has received important commendations, including recognition as a National Geographic Explorer, as well as a recipient of the UNM's Popejoy Prize, and the Newcomb Cleveland Prize from the American Association for the Advancement of Science. We are so glad to have Dr. William Taylor with us today. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Thank you so much, Tessa, and thank you to Homes for Horses Coalition and Animal Welfare Institute for inviting me to be here. It's it's a pleasure to connect with a group of folks that is engaged in such important work that almost always folks in this sphere have a tremendous amount of personal experience and connection with the topic, whether we're talking about horses or something else. And so for me, it's a big honor to be here to connect with you all today and share a little bit my own story and my own experience with you. So so without further ado, I'm here to talk with you about the pretty ambitious topic here about how horses shaped the human story and what that might mean for the world that we're in today. As Tessa mentioned, I'm Will. I'm the archaeology curator here at the CU Museum. For those I've noticed from the chat, folks are chiming in from all over the world. But for those that do cycle through Colorado, we are a free public museum, and we also care a lot about horses. So we'll have a new exhibit coming out soon, and we're always doing some programming and that sort of thing. So please do look us up if this stuff is interesting to you. So I will also say, paying attention to the chat, but I'm easily distracted if I try to read this stuff as I go. So I will probably address questions at the end, but I'm happy to hop back to any particular slide or topic if it's an important one. So don't be too offended if I move past and then circle back to it later. So, all right. So in our thinking about the world that we're in and our relationships with animals across the ancient world, there's probably no other event in human history that's quite as transformative, and no other relationship that's left quite as significant of an impact on who we are as humans, and definitely the world around us than the domestication of the horse. And how I got interested in exploring this topic is the story that I think probably many of you would find some resonance or some parallels with. Certainly many folks here in Colorado would tell some variant of this story here, which is, my own family history intersected with the horse in kind of an interesting uh, way. My own grandfather was like shown in this picture here, was a Montana cowboy, right? And my dad grew up on a ranch, intimately connected with horses. And, I uh, am the first member of the generation of a family that is very, very deeply embedded in horse culture that did not grow up with horses, right? So my dad became a lawyer, kind of moved to town, and then I grew up in this house filled with like, paintings of cowboys on the wall and, you know, gaudy brass horse lamps. If I was talking to you from home, you'd even see it behind me, but since I'm in the office, it's not here. But you probably all, would recognize the material culture of being a horse family, right? Is something that many of you would recognize. But so my grandfather was born, believe it or not, in 1903, and he died the year that I was born, and I pretty much never knew the guy, but kind of grew up in this shadow, right? And many folks around this country that has changed so drastically in the space of one human lifetime, right? Have a story to share that echoes or is similar to this in many different ways. And so I'm going to lay the foundation for this talk by talking about a piece of material, a little bit of material culture that I inherited from my grandfather. And at the end of the talk, I think I'm going to loop back to it and maybe reflect on how I look at this set of objects now versus how I once understood them. But so, like I said, I never met my grandfather, and I sort of know the man through his legacy and the objects that he left. And at one point, one of the things I inherited from him is this big, uh, 19th century suitcase filled with horse equipment, right? So lariats and lassos and spurs and harnesses and boots and hats and bridles, saddles, all this, the whole shebang. And, as a curious young man, this was kind of a, relic of the past, interesting stuff, but didn't carry a ton of meaning to me until I started to explore and connect with our relationship with horses. And I barreled past the slide here. I just want to say I recognize that, many of the folks in this call and certainly the team of folks that have brought me here today know and appreciate this significance and legacy of horses in our daily lives and are working very, very hard on different components of this topic. So that's kind of the framing for how we begin to explore this topic in the past, right? So as I grew up and sort of got into the field of archaeological science, became a scientist, became curious about the past, and it became my job to study the past, right? This kind of curiosity about my own family's relationship with horses, what it meant, how rapidly it had changed, sort of the whiplash around the difference between me as a young kind of like uh, nerdy kid who likes Star Wars in Montana versus my, sort of stoic, heroic cowboy grandfather. That the discrepancy was always interesting to me and something that I sort of wanted to pursue and study when I became an archaeologist. I had the incredible experience, right, to channel that little bit of curiosity into really powerful experiences. And my first job in archaeology, I was actually working on the other side of the world in one of the world's most active and healthy, vibrant contemporary horse cultures, right, in the steppes of Mongolia. And my first activity as like a graduate assistant, 20-year-old archaeologist with a shovel here was to help excavate a 2,500-year-old horse burial. And that horse happened to be really extraordinarily well preserved. There was like cool equipment. There was even gold. It was the only time in my career I've ever, worked with gold. But basically at the same time that I was working on this snapshot into the past, I was also living and working with uh, folks that were part of an active horse culture today, right? And so I was making friends. I started to learn to ride horses on my own, right? To develop my own connection and relationship with horses. And I started to see these threads linking the past and the present, right? So this became uh, it went from minor curiosity to the focus of my scientific scholarship, right? And investigating this stuff through the tools given to us through archaeology and archaeological science. So this has meant in the years since um, doing things that look a lot like what you might, you know, conjure up in your mind when you think about archaeology, gallivanting off to a far flung corner of the world and digging a hole in the ground, um, you know, traveling on horseback for weeks at a time to do uh, research about ancient horses. And it also looks um, like a lot of other things too that you might not immediately recognize as the activities of an archaeologist. But in 2025, almost said four, got to remember what year it is, this has now become, part of the life and the toolkit of an archaeologist here is doing things like understanding biomolecules preserved inside ancient bones, doing things like squeezing a pipette, right, or wearing rubber gloves, um, to work in museum collections, using emerging technologies, right, 3D scanning, sequencing ancient DNAs, isotopes, this whole range of new and emerging techniques that have become part of the journey in understanding our past as it relates to horses, right? So I'm going to distill together a lot of this stuff in the story that I tell you today. That means for the purposes of a short, hour together, I'm probably glossing over a lot of things. But if some of that method or process is interesting to you, I encourage you to, ask me about it in the Q&A, and I'm always happy to talk more about the nerdy details in cases where they're interesting to you. So we have a big task in front of us to summarize the entirety of sort of human history as they relate to horses. And perhaps controversially, I think this journey actually starts a very, very long time ago. And when I tell this story, I actually start at a pretty dramatic moment. No matter how you may feel about, the news of the week or the, politics or whatever is troubling you this week, I promise you the origins of the human horse story starts at a much worse moment in Earth's history, which is the extinction, the global extinctions related to the asteroids that wiped out the dinosaurs. It's an event that um, often referred to as like the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event. I mean, this was essentially an apocalypse, right? Wiped out a lot of terrestrial life on Earth. Anything big and walking on land was pretty much done for. And those clades of animals and life that managed to survive this um, looked a lot different than the animals before, right? So instead of large, dinosaurs wandering the land, we now had animals like mammals, which had survived this in many cases because of their ability to sort of, burrow underground or fly under the radar, kind of spilling out and emptying into a world of infinite ecological possibility, right? So both um, the deepest ancestors of horses and the deepest ancestors of primates sort of cut their teeth in this very rapidly changing world around, 50, 60 million years ago, in which there was endless ecological opportunity, and the landscapes and communities of the world were changing very, very quickly. So what you might often hear referred to as like a dawn horse, right? Or the deepest sort of ancestor of the horses didn't really look much like horses. And they were not living in environments that look much like where horses today, lived. In fact, both early primates and early horses were sort of making their way in these kind of forest margin landscapes. These early horses were small creatures, right? And you can see depicted in this drawing here, didn't have the characteristic single toe, right? They weren't even necessarily specialized in eating grasses, which were only beginning to take root as a important form of plant life on Earth. But over the millennia and over the millions of years, um, plants and animals communities around the globe began to change. And by around 20 to 30 million years ago, Earth had developed some new and pretty important ecosystems, right? So we began to have some open grassland habitats. Around 25 million years ago, we had our first sort of prairies, right? Our big open grasslands. And these new grasslands were, there was a lot of plant material there, right? A lot of things to eat. If you figured out how to navigate a grassland, there was a lot there for you. But there are also pretty incredible challenges to life in the grassland for a little critter, right? There's absolutely no protection, right? So you're exposed to the elements, you're exposed to predators, everyone can see you. And so a lot of the innovations that um, animals who evolved to live and thrive in these environments developed were actually sort of related to predator evasion. Horses and their, the earliest animals that we would really recognize a lot of the things that we'd uh, view as important traits of horses, right? Ability to, you know, uh, digest grasses, being really, really big and strong and fast. These started to develop alongside the emergence of grassland habitats. But I would say the most important traits of what it meant to be a horse and the ones that would really define our relationship with people were actually social and behavioral, right? Horses, to deal with living in the open grasslands, um, became incredibly good. They developed a cooperative herd structure, right? They became incredibly good communicators, probably almost unparalleled in the animal kingdom in their ultimately in their ability to communicate with people. That actually originates here in trying to find your way to thrive in these new open grassland environments, right? And as the Earth continued to change, right, the animals that we now today recognize as horses and their immediate relatives, right, donkeys, asses, zebras, they all kind of share a common origin within about the last 3 million years here to the most recent, well, second to most recent geologic era, Earth's last ice age, which we refer to as the Pleistocene. Now, this is an era of Earth being very, very cool, large global ice caps, but it also was pretty variable, right? Earth was changing rapidly between these frigid glacial periods and these warmer interglacial periods. There were, wild fluctuations in how much of Earth's water was in a ice cap, right? Where how high was sea level. And these fluctuations meant that sometimes North America was functionally part of other major land masses like Europe and Asia, right? We have these things that you might be familiar with, this Bering Land Bridge idea, right? So depending on what was happening with ice sheets and land connectivity, there were pulses of connection back and forth between these two continental land masses. So horses evolved actually for the first time in the kind of isolated subglacial steppes of North America. That's where the closest relatives, the ancestors of those animals we know today first developed. And during periods of interconnectivity, spread out into Europe, into Asia, and even into parts of Africa to give us the animals that we ultimately became adapted to a wide range of different habitats, not just the cold grasslands from which they developed, but also, deserts and steppe and, different opportunities presented by different corners of the world. Um, at the same time, the earliest human ancestors were doing a similar thing, moving out of their homeland in um, lower latitudes in Africa and spreading into Earth's great land masses. And by probably close to 2 million years ago, the earliest hominid ancestors had, moved into areas of Eurasia that overlapped with the early horse taxa that were in this region too. And so our first fossil overlap between our two faded organisms here was actually at a site called Dmanisi in Georgia, right? The country, not the state, dating to about 1.8 million years ago. And probably by around this time, folks were finding ways to eat horses, if we're not able to prove openly that they were directly hunting them. But in fact, humanity's oldest direct evidence for hunting with weapons of any taxon in the world comes from horses. And in some cases, this comes from clear fossil evidence, but believe it or not, in some cases there's literally like a smoking gun. Well, it's not a gun, but it's a smoking spear, if you will. So this is humanity's oldest weapons, at least those that have ever preserved in the fossil record. And they're wooden spears that come from the site of Schöningen in Germany and dating more than 300,000 years old. So these are before, Homo sapiens in this part of the world. This would have been a human ancestor called Homo heidelbergensis. There are other sites across, Europe and Asia that testify to a very early and complex set of interactions between people and horses. And showing a ton of sophisticated ecological knowledge. So at Schöningen and other sites like Boxgrove in the UK, that's even older, 500,000 or 750,000 years ago, it's clear folks were ambush hunting. They were, finding horses along their migratory corridors or waterways. They were using horse uh, materials to make tools, right? So we have bone tools already made from horse remains at 500,000 or 750,000 years ago. Um, Folks clearly had a large knowledge of horse ecology and behavior that were informing their choices. And this is long before most folks would even recognize, these hominins as quote unquote modern humans, right? So a very deep-seated and sophisticated connection going back to the earliest chapters of what it means to be human. And here's some of these bone tools, for example, from Boxgrove, right? As the first humans made their way, modern humans made their way once again in another pulse of movement out of Africa and into Eurasia. Um, Horses are tied in for with some of the things we consider um, defining markers of what it means to be a modern human, right? And so this is a paper that actually summarized all the Paleolithic artistic depictions of animals in Eurasian and North African artwork from the last 50,000 years, right? Um, and turns out that the number one most commonly depicted animal here was actually the horse. Now, this is paired with some patterns in the archaeological record. We can see that horses were also, one of or usually the most common animal in folks' diet too. But it wasn't just about, hunting. it's clear from these sites, some of which I've actually been to myself here, including this one here in a cave called Neo Grotto in the south of France. You go to a place like this and you recognize, there is a spiritual and ceremonial and religious aspect to this relationship already by tens of thousands of years ago. I mean, this place was literally like the heart of the earth. I think it takes like 45 minutes of climbing downwards into pure darkness to get to a spot like this. And so clearly, it's not just, this hunter-prey dynamic, which of course we can see, reflected in things like the faunal record. So very clearly, horses are among the oldest and most important human-animal connection. They go back to what it means to be human from a dietary or subsistence standpoint, connected with people from the very beginning. But most of the time, when folks want to understand that relationship and what makes it unique from others in the world, they're curious about, what does it mean to be a domestic animal? And in fact, when we think about horses, really, really extraordinary that we took what happened to be, in many ways, our most important prey animal, and we ended up in a spot where we hop on its back in an unguarded and unprotected part of its body, and we collaboratively travel around and do many other things with horses too, right? Other than simply transport with them. But this was an extraordinary change of relationship, and one that has, given us a lot of what we would call human history. So most of the time, when folks are curious about this, what they actually want to know is not when did we start making spears to hunt them, but how did this very unique relationship begin, right? And my work has sought to try to understand this process. It's very, very challenging. The further we go back in time, the fewer, historic records, even artistic paintings, obvious and immediate corollaries we have to ask these questions. And most of what we know now is very, very new knowledge. And that new knowledge is coming from an emerging toolkit that we have to allow us to explore and understand the deep past beyond the limits of other types of data sets, right? And I kind of lump these things together in something that we will call scientific archaeozoology. It basically means the scientific study of animal remains that have made it through into the modern world from the past. And this can mean a whole lot of different techniques, some of which I showed you before, right? Everything from the sequencing the genome of animals themselves to different kinds of osteology, taphonomy, things that would kind of look like forensic or veterinary science, but done on really ancient things. What I am specialized a lot in myself is animal paleopathology. And I should caution you because I know this is a group of folks that do a lot of advocacy. This is not just about identifying health problems, right? Or discomfort or these sort of things. It's actually about the skeleton itself as a record of life, right? And a record of all the vagaries of life, not just disease or violence or mechanical stress, but also just what you're doing, right? The skeleton as a living tissue is chronicling all the things that both humans and animals do now and in the past. And so when I kick the bucket, somebody's going to be able to look at, if they were so inclined, could look at my skeletal remains and say that I sat here writing a lot of emails, right? Or that I was right-handed, or perhaps that they could reconstruct some of my old football injuries, these sort of things, right? And so when we recognize so much of an animal's life is actually encoded in their bones, from how old they were, their health problems, whether it was male or female, what they were doing with their physical body. And by understanding the animals that live today, looking at museum collections all over the world, animals with different known life histories. You might even know some of these animals that I've looked at their skeletal remains, right? Like famous race horses, you know, the horse of General John Blackjack Pershing in the Spanish-American War, or wild horses from the Navajo Reservation across the American West, Assateague and Chincoteague Island. By looking at animals who've lived through a variety of these different life histories, able to kind of reconstruct the way that different things from captivity to health to stress to different kinds of transport can show up in the skeleton and use these tools to understand the past. So this means in the right circumstances, we can look at, as you can see in the figure on the left, from ancient context in China, a group of animals that were buried alongside chariots, right? Versus a group of animals that were used for mounted riding, and see by just the occurrence of small skeletal changes, which type of sort of transport strategy an animal might have been used with in the deep past. We can also even reconstruct different and unique configurations of equipment, right? So every bridle, every bit, or even riding without a bit, right? These things all actually have different mechanical relationships to the body. And with enough context, you can often reconstruct different patterns and osteological traces of how these things might have operated in the past, right? So using this sort of work, we've worked on trying to ask the question, where and when were horses first domesticated? Now, this is not a new question. And it's one that's been tackled and looked at and pontificated on for many decades, right? And up until recently, I would say there was a near consensus on some variant of a particular idea, right? And in particular, this one you might even have heard about, within the last few months because it's still got traction in certain circles. The idea articulated by folks like David Anthony, um, going back to scholars from the 20th century, Gimbutas was influential. Many others over the years have linked um, things like horse domestication, Indo-European languages, and cultural changes that we can see definitely happened across the ancient world. And many interesting ones happened in the fourth millennium BC. In particular, there's evidence of people moving out of the Eastern European steppes north of the Black Sea, kind of between the Black and Caspian Sea, the western edge of Asia and the eastern edge of Europe. We see evidence for people and cultures and objects moving out of these regions into some impressively far away regions. Folks and burial traditions and new kinds of artifacts moving into Central Europe, moving out of Eastern Europe as far away as the Russian Altai, or believe it or not, the Mongolian Hanggai Mountains in the center of Mongolia, all in the fourth millennium BC, right? A very long time ago. This hypothesis, sometimes called the Kurgan hypothesis, because it's associated with the spread of new kinds of mounded burials, right, which we call kurgans, right? And long ago, before we had the scientific archaeozoology to kind of trace how horses fit into the story, there were contextual clues that folks leaned on a lot. One of those was there's apparently, new kinds of object that could be early horse equipment, right? So this is one of these types of equipment that for a while was thought of as potentially related to early horsemanship. These kind of copper loop things, which also appear in some burials of this time period. But and I could ramble on for hours about some of the different contextual things that folks brought up, changes in the number or the shape of different bones found at sites, where these mounds spread, any number of different, what I might call kind of circumstantial clues that could be linked to horses. But as our data sets have gotten better, kind of the underlying foundation of this idea has sort of fizzled away, right? And one example here, just sticking with this copper loop example, eventually folks found some of these things in situ, right? Here's a great example of these being found in situ. Very exciting, new discovery. Well, we've actually got these things in context with animal bones. Unfortunately, the animal that they're found in context with is actually cattle, not horses, right? And so the archaeological record around this time period suggesting that perhaps these changes in mobility here these new patterns and movements and even new types of artifact may actually be linked to other kinds of animal transport being developed for the first time. More recently, over the last 15 years or so, there's been interest in connecting some of these patterns found in like the Kuragan hypothesis with other perhaps more compelling archaeological assemblages. And the main leading candidate here is a site called Botai. This site, not the bow tie that you wear with your tuxedo, but a location here in northern Kazakhstan, in which uh, also dating to this late 4th millennium BC, in which there's hundreds and thousands of horse bones found from the site. Sounds compelling, right? A very large assemblage, almost 100% horse remains. And Botai became famous because in the early days of understanding how horse transport might relate to the horse skeleton, there are a few features in Botai that look like they could be related to transport. In particular, this one tooth with damage that we often find on ancient horses controlled with a metal bit, right? And the mouthpiece of a bridle kind of bumping in to the front margin of that second premolar in the horse. This was kind of emerged something that folks call bit wear as a potential indicator of early horse transport. Also, some stable isotope work suggested, hey, maybe clearly folks at Botai were eating a lot of horse fat, and maybe those fats, line up with our expectations for milk rather than other kinds of fats, right? But there were always critics of Botai, and there were always a lot of kind of potential wrinkles in this hypothesis that needed explanation. One of the, main ones here is that the assemblage demographically, the animals found at Botai look the same as those found in hunting assemblages going back to the last ice age. And you hunt animals, the animals that you find in a hunted assemblage may more commonly reflect their natural demographics, right? But if you're managing a herd of animals and care about their reproductive success, you can't just, cull whichever animal you like. In particular, reproductive age animals are sort of a no-go. And especially among reproductive age animals, uh, female mortality is devastating for your herd's reproductive outcomes the next year, right? And at Botai, the assemblage is sort of 50-50 male and female. Most of the animals are of a healthy reproductive age, and even among the reproductive age females, there's even pregnant mares and some of these categories of animals which would be sort of disastrous to be selecting for a natural pastoral herd. Some of the Botai horses are even jabbed in the ribs with a harpoon, which is not the most, logical way to dispose of a domestic horse, right? It indicates that very much so that some of these horses were hunted, some even embedded in the harpoons, even embedded in the ribs, as you see here. But the real kind of explosion in the scientific community came at circa 2017 with new archaeogenomic techniques, which said, hey, we can identify, what animals we're looking at here. And the argument with Botai had always been morphologically, these are domestic horses. Unfortunately, morphology not a great reliable tool for tracing species in horses and their close relatives, which at the time included a lot more taxa that are no longer alive today. And in sequencing the genome of horses from Botai, folks found out they're unrelated to the horses that are alive today. And in fact, they are all a species that does still exist today, called Przewalski's horse, right? Or Equus przewalski. These are horses that look a lot like what you might recognize in cave paintings, right? Kind of spiky mane, dun color with a white chest, and sort of survived a close call with extinction in the 20th century and have now been reintroduced to the steppes of Mongolia, Kazakhstan, China, and some different areas around the world. In fact, there was quite a funny anecdote in which a few turned up at a livestock auction in Utah and western Colorado recently. So, but very much not the case. Actually, if you want a funny afternoon activity, go read the New York Times article about this from the fall, in which a Utah cowboy bought one of these and tried to train it to ride. And you can hear his experience with trying to train a Przewalski's horse to be a domestic horse in the way that he was expecting. And so behaviorally, these are animals that have been known throughout human history, even in places like Mongolia, very deeply interdigitated with horses. And while they certainly might have occasionally interbred, very much not an animal with an easy behavioral track record with people. Other recent genomic work that's followed up has shown basically what we recognize as the ancestors of domestic horses showed up very, very rapidly just before 2000 BC, resulting in an almost total turnover of the genomic landscape of ancient Eurasia. So while these sequencing efforts have pointed us to the kind of the roughly the same region here, the steppes, north of the Black and Caspian Seas, they're telling us that the timing is really, really off from our expectations. Perhaps, 1,500 years or so after the kind of core ideas in the Kurgan hypothesis might have suggested, right? So that leaves us asking a lot of questions. My colleague and I revisited the bow tie evidence in light of this, asking, have we maybe gotten something wrong about our basic understanding of bow tie and domestication? We looked at the teeth from bow tie, for example, and found while there certainly are some reliable tools for tracing, horse domestication out there now, um, the features that in 2009 looked like they were evidence of bridles and bits are actually found in wild horses in various degrees, including, basically this stuff may just be enamel hypoplasia and natural defects in the cementum, right? Um, Other folks have looked at better techniques for tracing horse milk, things like found in your little dental calculus, the stuff your dentist will scrape away when you haven't been brushing your teeth. We can actually find species-specific milk proteins in this stuff now, and unfortunately, these new techniques have failed to replicate any evidence for horse milk until much later in the journey. In many cases, the second millennium BC or so, before this stuff starts to show up. That's left a lot of us kind of scratching our heads and saying, how do we understand horse domestication if this timeline is just totally off, right? We might have been looking in the right region, but we're off by a few thousand years. And what does that mean for the big picture? Well, I'm blowing past a lot of this, and we'll get into it more in Hoof Beats, but the big takeaway here is under the new timeline and having a look at what the science says and what else is happening in Eurasia, it looks a lot like the origins of horse domestication begin with other animals, right? In many ways, the earliest animal transport actually starts with animals like cattle, beginning around 4000 BC, going south across the Caucasus Mountains into places like Mesopotamia, where cattle and other animals began to be used for agricultural work, right? Beginning with sledges, eventually folks invented a wagon. As it won't surprise you to know, pretty soon after folks invented the wagon and the wheels, they found ways to use it to kill each other. But these ancient battle carts, as folks sometimes call them, were not very impressive, and they were probably not very fast, right? And moving from cattle, other early domestic animals, including so the first domestic equids here, and even the second domestic equids here, probably not the horse now on this new timeline. Donkeys show up in ancient Egypt around 3000 BC. Soon after that, donkeys spread into Mesopotamia, and they add donkeys to our clunky little cattle battle carts, right? So may not be the most fearsome sounding, battle device you could think of now, but back in 2500 BC in Mesopotamia, that's what folks were using. And believe it or not, new genomic work, along with animal paleopathology, is showing us that donkeys weren't even the equid domesticated in this early period of time. In fact, sequencing of animals from sites in places like this is the site of al Mara in Syria, from around this time period show 50-50 hybrids between donkeys and the Syrian wild ass, right? Or an animal you might also hear called an onager or a humion, right? So folks began to experiment breeding their slow but domesticated animals and adapting their technological framework for other ways to make it faster, to connect in with new kinds of creature. And obviously, this one didn't really stick. And one of the reasons why they might have been limited here, you can be seen in this picture on the right-hand side, the technology actually didn't involve bridles or bits at this time either. And from what we can tell from iconographic depictions, the main way most of these animals were controlled was either a nose or a lip ring, a single rein, and a pretty straightforward and simple set of devices. And it may have been, the interdigitation of this complex, emerging technological system and set of relationships between people and animals, spreading across, out of Mesopotamia and into the steppes that really brought horses into this uh, technological sphere for the first time, right? And what we now know is that the genomic and the archaeological evidence for horsemanship converging on a single point in time, sort of the same story coming out of both data sets and pointing to these Black Sea steppes sometime just prior to 2000 BC. I think in the years ahead, we're going to learn a lot about exactly what was going on in this region and this time. But by the time there's a clear signature in the archaeological record and our, ancestors of the first domestic horses can be identified clearly, they're already involved in clear cultural context. These chariot burials of the Sintashta culture show that the first horse domestication was paired with the first horse transport, and it was paired with important technological innovations here. One of those is the first bridle and the first bit. And by bit, I mean like a gentle, organic, soft mouthpiece that did not preserve in the archaeological record, but leaving us only with kind of the hard components of this technological system. But it also mean, and I have one here in my office as we're working on our exhibit here, the first spoked wheel, right? So up until this point, our cattle and our donkey battle carts were sort of using these Fred Flintstone wheels, solid planks, right? And the lower speeds and lower stress of this probably made that fine. But horse transport was a whole different level in terms of speed and logistics and intensity. And this new technology, I think, clearly played an important role. So very, very quickly, what this means now is rather than like a gradual, slow, multi-century process, horse domestication was basically a lightning strike across the ancient world. And within a few centuries, horses spread from their, zone of their early domestication across an incredible region of ancient Eurasia. And while in the steppes that process was probably pretty peaceful, folks began to integrate horses into their herding life. It increased their mobility, herding different kinds of animals, surviving in drier or more seasonal environments, and really, developing these highly mobile steppe pastoralism for the first time. In other parts of the ancient world, this was pretty rough. It was a bad development if you were a person in power in lower latitudes of Eurasia or North Africa in the second millennium BC. And so within the space of about 500 years, horses and people who had horses really toppled the great dynasties of the ancient world, from Egypt to Greece to the Indus Valley and even into China, right? And ending, for example, the Old Kingdom of Egypt with the invasion of folks, in this case, who weren't even Indo-European speakers, but had horses, right? I call this one the Hyksos invasion. Horses then began to be a key source of power for establishing, your military or your economy or your communication system across the ancient world. And this was a very, very dynamic um, time that really rewrote the geopolitics of almost a whole continent in a few hundred years. An example of this from China is, as horses spread into China in the late Shang dynasty, initially they were sort of an elite curiosity, right? The king was using them, horses for hunting, and they show up in a few elite burials. But by 1100 BC, those who could have field a chariot army of horses deposed and destroyed the Shang dynasty, replacing it with the Zhou, right? And this really reverberated across the ancient world. Um, of course, folks often wonder why it is that that the first horse transport seems so chariot oriented. And in fact, probably from an early stage, there was some mounted horseback riding going on. And we can see clues as to what and why and how this transport system might have changed over time. This is the tomb of, or the, sorry, the temple of Ramses the Great here in Egypt, in Luxor. I visited this place. Amazing place, if you ever get the chance to go there. Entire walls painted with giant battle scenes, all depicting horses and almost all depicting chariots, right? But in the second millennium BC, you can see a few examples that tell you a lot about what was going on with horse transport. And these are the few riders, for example, that are hidden away in the panels of these great murals. Show people were riding horses, but they were doing different things. They were certainly not riding them widely into battle. In this case, you've got these little, it's kind of hard to see here, but little naked fellows, sometimes holding a message or something like that. Probably scouts and messengers, and cases in which speed was desired at all costs. And when we do see battle and cavalry showing up in the archaeological record, this is the oldest, I think, depiction of cavalry in the ancient world, dating to around 900 BC. And you can actually see it was a team sport. If you look sort of hidden behind our first rider with the bow and arrow, you can see there's another rider nearby holding the reins, right? And I think what this tells us is that in the early days of horse transport, the level of control and um, sort of immediate high stakes leverage and ability to put a horse into a situation like a chaotic battle environment would have been a lot different. And chariots providing a little bit level of, person's not jumping on the animal's back. There's a team of two. There's a little bit more ability to navigate these different kinds of environments. But that began to change with changes in horse equipment. And we see that early cavalry in particular seems to be associated with a widespread development of the kind of jointed metal mouthpiece or snaffle bit, which very rapidly spread across the steppes. Especially the emergence of riding meant that each individual person was in control of their own fate. They could travel long distances. They also, could potentially be a soldier or a person on the battlefield. And what this began to do is center political power, geopolitical, cultural power, economic power, and just make the grassland habitats of the ancient world a central place in a way they had never been, right? So we began to see the emergence of steppe empires, and not just steppe empires, but steppes as places to be, right? We can see it emerging. This is a human genomic record of Mongolia in the first millennium BC, where we see they essentially became cosmopolitan places where people, if you ever get a chance, read the first 2 or 3 chapters of the Travels of Marco Polo, where we think of him as an explorer. This is a guy who had no interest in ending up in the capital of the Mongol Empire. He accidentally stumbled into the wrong corner of the Black Sea and was sort of whisked away, right, because of the economic and social gravity, political power that began to emerge in steppe environments. This is one object that I really like as showing that story. This is from an elite burial in Mongolia, right, which began to emerge as, steppe states here in the first millennium. It's the Greek hero Hercules, engaged in a bit of, unmentionable act here, I guess, but this is a Mediterranean artifact in the heart of Mongolia, 2,200 years ago. And horses really are at the heart of this reorientation and connection of the continent in a way that it had never been. Separate, disparate societies became a thing of the past, and an interconnected, globalized world began to emerge. Not just centered on the steppes as places of connection and power, but also for desire to get horses for those who didn't have it, right? So the Silk Road emerging as, essentially a trade network desiring to supply horses to places like China, out of their sustained centuries-long conflict with those who lived in the steppes to the north, right? Horse country. Steppe folks also emerged as innovators. And have coming out of places like Mongolia the earliest evidence for veterinary intervention in dentistry, right? New kinds of horse techniques, horse rearing, horse care, and even new technologies. So this is essentially from what we know now, the oldest frame saddle anywhere in the world, coming out of Western Mongolia, circa 300 CE. Also, innovation of the stirrups in this region and roughly around this time. And these technologies would continue to sort of radiate their impact across the ancient world, right? With the saddle and the stirrup, right, kicking off another new wave of sort of comparative advantage on the battlefield. And, migrations out of the steppe from the losers of new geopolitical, processes happening in the steppes, also resulting in waves of invaders into places like Europe and which sort of became passive recipients of history for a period of time, might also know as the Dark Ages, right? So horses really had had a tremendous impact on the steppes of Eurasia. But at a certain point, they sort of reached some hard boundaries as to where they could spread, right? The Sahara Desert, the great oceans of the world. And the 14th and 15th century really saw this start to change, right? So beyond the early spread of horses across the ocean to places like Japan, the British Isles, even places like Iceland and Greenland, by the 14th century, horses had spread across the deserts of the Sahara into, for example, the Sahel region of West Africa, where horse empires developed to rival any in other, the Eurasian steppes. Across the open oceans, horses spread around the Horn of Africa into not just the Americas, but also Australasia and the Pacific, giving rise to similar developments in which they empowered even indigenous folks, who initially um, encountering the horse as an agent of colonization, but soon turning their relationship with horses into transcontinental trade networks and even sustaining political sovereignty well into the mechanized era. Of course, the Industrial Revolution really reoriented our relationship with horses. And initially, this did not actually reduce the importance of horses in society, even a very increasingly mechanized one, especially in the Western world. This gave us more and more heavy demands on horses in terms of labor. Horses began to use in, agricultural activities with heavy metal down in the mines, right? Even horse-powered ferries were a thing in this country. And this period of time is where we actually see most of what we now recognize as horse breeds coming into existence, right? So, in particular, large draft horses, owe most of their existence and most of their size to this, shift in a mechanized era. Horses were asked to bridge the gap between an emerging, globalizing railroad system, right? And so you had this things like the Pony Express period, right, linking, you know, um, the central U.S. with California. Um, this in some corners of the world, horse-based infrastructure managed to persist a very long time, right? And in Mongolia, where this little image is showing, horse-based postal relay even used as late as the 1950s, right? But ultimately, a gasoline, combustion engine, the globalized infrastructure did change a lot of our relationship with horses today. It meant that in many corners of the world, you no longer rode a horse to work, right? A lot of horses were rounded up and sent to slaughter because they, rather than like a potential source of extra value to especially Western societies, they then became sort of a pest or a competition, or at very least, no longer valued the way that they had been very, very, recently before. And so, over a very, very hectic period of time in the early to mid 20th century, um, the number of horses on the landscape changed in a lot of regions. They were sort of exterminated wholesale. But I think also a lot, maybe too much is made how drastic this reduction was. Because in many areas of the world, there are still millions of horses. In Mongolia, there's more horses than people. In this country, I want to say there's probably still 7 million horses or thereabouts, right? It's incredibly entrenched on the landscape, and even despite the mechanization, sort of retaining a lot of this the the roles that they played in our society, which was a very, very short time, again, one human lifetime ago, where, basically everything from agriculture to communication and military, um, sport, livelihoods, and even, life on the landscape as a wild animal, only a very few short number of decades ago. And so we're now entering this chapter of the human story in which uh, we've really rapidly shifted from, millennia of horses becoming an increasingly ubiquitous part of life all around the globe, whether that's a few centuries of a story or a few thousand years, and in which, um, almost every component of life and culture was reliant on horses. We're now in one in which the role of horses is being actively negotiated and navigated, right? And in many parts of the world, horses do still, fill that ride your horse to work role. And I work in some of them. I'm sure many of you do. If you're in agriculture or, sport, some of these things are more obvious. I think, though, that the whiplash from the mechanization of the world is causing a lot of folks to also sort of rejuvenate roles that have maybe been lost over the recent decades, right? I know, in Indian country, for example, folks are working really hard to restore the role of horses in things like ceremony or youth programs, right? Um, Traditional hunts. And of course, in our world now, folks are realizing there are many parts of the relationship with horse for things like therapy, um, that relate to that human and horse connection that have sort of been lost by the sort of rapid mechanization of the human horse relationship and are working hard to kind of protect and restore some of those roles. And I think the work of HHC and Animal Welfare Institute is a great example of those negotiations that are ongoing now, that I think are playing an important role in a future that's still going to have this very, very deep and intimate connection between people and horse. I will close because we're coming to the end of our time. Close by returning, as I said I would, to that reflection of my grandfather's horse equipment and what it means to me now after thinking, working in different corners of the world and thinking about the past. In that box of horse equipment, I now no longer see just some interesting old stuff from Grandpa. I can see threads and connections, whether they're cultural or technological or tradition or even style, that show that link, that box of horse equipment in eastern Montana to everything from the spurs that were invented in Central Europe in the first millennium BC. I see the bridles that take us back to Sintashta at the origin of horse domestication. I see the basic configuration of a saddle and stirrup that link me to Mongolia in the 3rd century CE and the innovations of steppe people. I see the styles and designs and configuration of technology and tradition that go back not just to Spanish colonists of the Americas, but actually to Islamic North Africa, Arabia before that, right? And bridal designs and styles and traditions that can connect indigenous cultures, tradition in a set of threads and a sort of a tapestry of influence and connection that is truly global in scope and goes back, at least 4,000 years. So, in doing so, I think in looking at this equipment now, I really have a deep appreciation for just how many threads have entered that human horse story, from our first extinction of the dinosaurs to our earliest human ancestors and through the amazing set of innovations and connections that have brought us to where we are today. It makes me confident that there's an important role for horses to play in our future, and that there's many chapters of that human horse story that have yet to be told. So with that, I appreciate your time and attention, and happy to answer any questions you may have, and appreciate you being with us here today.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was incredible. I learned so much and had no idea how like divisive, how many different theories there were about domestication. That was really fascinating. And I look forward to learning more in the future as that knowledge develops. We had a question from Linda kind of early on about the map of dispersal, and she was curious if that's a map that she could get access to. She
Yeah,
said, is
there's
it?
a great way to get access to it, which is purchase the book Hoof Beats by
Yeah.
William Taylor. I'm just joking, of course. There are actually other versions of this map out there too. Um, y- we're the cover story of Scientific American from December, and they made a like a little bit, stripped down, simpler version of this. If you're trying to use this for a specific purpose, you could reach out to me and you need the, high res digital copy for something, I'm happy to talk about that. But yeah, this is from Hoofbeats. So
Perfect plug there. Um, Dorothy had a question. If Przewalski's horse isn't the ancestor of modern domestic horses, what is?
so this is a great question because, ultimately, um, one of the sort of unsatisfying parts of this deluge of archaeological science on the topic is that we're left with um, pointing at a particular time and region that is essentially the Ukrainian war zone, right? And so we don't have a lot of nuance in terms of understanding what was going on in this, Ural region, Black Sea steppes. Uh, what were relationships with people and horses? We do know, essentially they're the same animal that they are today in terms of what was going on with people and horses at this time. They were the Western steppe variant of, uh, the horses that we know and love. Uh, Probably, and this is a little bit speculation, but probably what differentiated them from Przewalski's horse, other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or people that were interested in, horse transport, um, I would guess that those main differences are behavioral, right? More than anything. That they were a little bit less attack you and bite you. Um, that folks had, as we can see from the experimentation with things like the onager, folks were clearly in this region trying to see, which animals they could sustain a connection with in this kind of transport domestication situation. Um, they were definitely, we can key them into this region, Black Sea steppes. They were very horsey like. They essentially are the same species. And if they had major differences, I would guess most of them, a good cognate for what these animals would look like. I would guess a more ornery version of what is today a Mongolian horse, right? So a little bit stumpier, a little bit more cold adapted, and probably a little grumpier, but essentially the horses that we would know.
Marcy had a question. Please clarify. I thought you said horses developed in North America, cold grasslands, but then talked about horses in Europe and Georgia.
Yeah, so I actually didn't include a slide. I probably should have, kind of talking about what we know about North America, um, because there's a lot of ongoing scholarship on this topic too. Horses evolved as a species independently from people, and they did so at a time when North America was isolated from, these other continents. They then spread into this region. They also continued to exist in North America, and you can read a lot about this in Hoofbeats if it's interesting to you. Some sites here related to early human occupation of North America show that people overlapped with horses for the early chapters, right? There are sites on the North American continent that are still on the other side of what would have been these massive ice sheets separating the two continents, where we know that 23,000 years ago, folks were hunting and eating horses in like the Canadian Yukon. This site, Bluefish Caves, is one of these incredible spots. As soon as people were south of the ice, as early as 13, 14,000 years ago, they clearly overlapped with horses. This site, Wally's Beach, is amazing. Um, 13,300 years ago, folks were hunting and eating horses in southern Alberta. There's a site here called Page Ladson from the Osceola River in Florida, where there are bone tools made out of, these wild relatives of horses that were indigenous to North America at 13,000 years ago. As far as we can tell, basically as we went over the last 15,000 years, the sort of zone of occupancy of domestic horses kind of shifted northwards to the point where our very last evidence for horses in North America before, their reintroduction was probably around 5,000 years ago at these high latitudes, 5 or 6,000 years ago. And but it's important to note these are essentially not really a fundamentally different animal than the horses that were reintroduced. They might have been a little more cold adapted, as were the ancestors of domestic horses, and that's probably why there was this latitudinal gradient, right? Is that they're with the climate warming over the last 15,000 years, their kind of zone of their sweet spot here moved northwards. But I think the success of uh, wild horses since their reintroduction here um, is a testament to just how deep-seated their kind of coevolution with the American landscape actually is, right? They are, from one perspective, very, very deeply anchored in the plant and animal communities of this part of the world, right? And um, they're our research, our scholarship on when and how they were sort of introduced into this part of the world shows that the process was much more ancient, perhaps, than folks would have recognized from European historic records, going back, at least 400 years in a lot of the corners of the Rockies and the plains, and doing so in a way that didn't really have anything directly to do with European presence in a region, right? This is not the Spanish who introduced horses, even if they are ultimately the ones that live here today, are of an Iberian ancestry. They kind of kicked off both through their connectivity with indigenous cultures as well as their kind of ecological, sort of channel that had been grooved for them, I believe, from that deeper evolutionary history. So that's a very long answer because it's a very complex topic, but I hope it demonstrates to you a the long, long history between people and horses in this continent, the way that their contemporary roles interface with this deeper evolutionary history, right? The complexity of that, even the historic um, knowledge around horses. And, I do believe firmly that it underscores their importance as an animal on the landscape today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. It was so fantastic to have you here. You're getting lots of thank yous in the chat.
Yeah, I'll
We
look at the chat now that I.
Yeah, Kathleen has a really nice message for you. Beautifully choreographed this presentation, the timeline somewhat resonating with the time you spent on each part of history, and you speak about the future of the horse-human connection. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you all for your time and for your nice comments. I will say if I didn't quite get to your comments, I'm happy to, you all can send me a message, through my website, or I'll just put my email there. I really don't mind at all, having a little bit of correspondence and that sort of thing. It's fun. It's always nice to connect with other horse people. So
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for attending and for your attention. And thanks again, Will, for being here. I'll send out the recording and I'll include the email in there as well. So thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
thank you all. I appreciate it.
Bye bye.